Walt Kowalski once said to me that I didn't know anything about life or death because I was an overeducated 27-year-old virgin who held the hands of superstitious old women and promised them eternity. Walt definitely had no problem calling it like he saw it. But he was right. I knew really nothing about life or death until I got to know Walt. And boy, did I learn.
And I want to leave my house to the church because Dorothy would have liked it. Now, which brings us to our last item. And again, please excuse the language in Mr. Kowalski's will. I'm simply reading it the way it was written. And I'd like to leave my 1972 Gran Torino to my friend, Tau Van Loor, on the condition that you don't top the roof like one of those beaners. Don't paint any idiotic flames on it like some white trash hillbilly, and don't put a big gay spoiler on the rear end like you see on all the other Zipperheads cars. It just looks like hell. If you can refrain from doing any of that, it's yours.
So tenderly, your story, nothing more than what you see or what you've done or will become. Standing strong, do you will?
Good morning. Good to see all of you here. Man, wow. Let me just welcome all of you who are live here at the El Paso campus, here in El Paso, Texas. We're glad that you're with us today. Let me also welcome those of you who are joining us online, all over the United States as well as literally around the world. We love you. Thank you for being part of our family. It's just really awesome to have you all here. Let me say to those of you who are viewing us online that if you're checking us out online, hey, go to the contact page, drop us a line, let us know that you're listening in. We'd love to hear from you. Also, for those of you who would like to be able to give online, you can do that as well. There's a donate button on the front page there of our website, and you can just click on that, and it's really easy. So whatever Lord leads you to do, you just do that. Let me just welcome you to week number 1 of our brand new series called The Will. The Will. That's why I showed this clip, is because it was about the reading of a will. How many of you have seen the movie Gran Torino? Really good one, and probably most of us guys really like it. It was a really good show. And by the way, it makes me think of Ken Arnold. Those of you who here know Ken Arnold or knew him, they moved away here a while back, and he was always complaining about it was always too hot. Well, I got a message from him this morning. He said, man, it's hot in here. He's over there where all the flooding and all that stuff is, and they've had a lizard and a snake in the house, and of course his wife just screeches and she's ready to move out tomorrow. That's fine. Come on back home. We can use you here. It's really good. Anyway, what we're going to be doing in this particular series called The Will is we're going to be looking at what God promised that He would do way back in the Old Testament times in providing the answer to the problems of sin and death. God promised to do that from basically the very beginning. And the way we're going to be doing that, looking at that particular subject, is by examining the reasons why the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ are of such extreme importance. But with a little bit of a twist, possibly, because not only are we going to be looking at how important that is to us, because we do that a lot, don't we? We look at how important that particular event is to us, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But what we really want to look at is how that affected and what that had to do with the people in the Old Testament who lived in thousands of years past, specifically during the Old Testament times, and also as well as those who will live in the future. What that single event had to do with those in the past, with us, and with those in the future. Okay, and the reason I've called it The Will is because we're going to be kind of focusing on what that had to do with Old Testament people, Old Testament saints, or whatever you want to call them. So, how many of you have ever wondered how people in the Old Testament were saved? Anybody ever wondered that? I used to wonder that a lot. You know, how in the world were people in the Old Testament saved, I mean, Jesus hadn't died yet. None of that had taken place. They weren't living during New Testament times when we look back and we say, well, Jesus died as the total payment for all our sins, all those different kind of things. And I mean, I've always thought about the people in the Old Testament, and I wondered, how in the world did they get into heaven? How did that happen? What way did God provide them for becoming a believer, if you want to call it that, and getting into heaven? Well, probably one of the most common assumptions about the Old Testament times and how people got into heaven is that the people who lived during the Old Testament times got into heaven by keeping the Old Testament law, like the Ten Commandments, that's how they did that. That God had given them these commandments and said, here's all these rules and regulations, follow these, and everything's cool, right? I mean, I guess I'd always assumed for many years that, since God gave them the Ten Commandments and told them to live by them, then that must have been the way that He intended for them to, be right with God, to become holy, become righteous, and then, get into heaven. In other words, follow the rules, go to heaven. Don't follow the rules, go to hell. That kind of thing, that kind of an idea about Old Testament people. As a matter of fact, the majority of my growing up years, in particular, my assumption had always been that the reason God seemed to be so, vengeful in the Old Testament, and maybe I was taught this, or maybe I just naturally thought this, I don't know. Maybe some of you have kind of thought the same thing, that the reason God was so vengeful in the Old Testament is because people just didn't follow the rules, right? I mean, if you followed the rules, God wouldn't have to punish you, right? And in the Old Testament, He seems really vengeful because they didn't follow the rules. And if they didn't follow the rules, then, stuff happened, Sure, He might give them a second chance or two. He might say, okay, don't ever do this again. And sure enough, they might do it again and all those different kind of things, Like one time He simply, opened up and made the earth open up and, swallowed a few thousand of them. Well, you may not recognize him, but that's Korah there standing right on the edge of he's one of the Old Testament people that was, well, anyway, it's a joke. It's okay. You'll get it later, all right? Think on it. But that's what God did, right? He opened up the earth and swallowed several thousand people because they had, they weren't basically, in our terms, we'd say they weren't following the rules kind of a thing. But whatever method God might choose to, to discipline them or whatever on any particular occasion, in my mind, the basic reason seemed to always be the same. When God finally had His fill of their shenanigans, He said, that's enough, and He wiped them out, right? Whether it was a flood or whether it was opening the earth to swallow them or all those different kind of things, and start over with somebody else. If you're not going to do this, I'll just find somebody else who will, wipe them out, start over, those kind of things. And I have to admit that I hate to admit this, but I really hate to admit that, but that sounds an awful like somebody I know really well. Me. I'm one of those people that's kind of a slow burn, if you know what I mean. I'm kind of a slow burn. I put up with a lot. I do a lot of things. Those kind of things. But you know what? There comes a time in my life sometimes with individuals or situations or whatever when I say, that's it. I'm done. I've had enough. I ain't doing this no more. You know what I mean? Maybe some of you are like that, I kind of envy in some ways people who are a short burn, because they just get mad, get it out of the way and go on, Well, I just put up with it and put up with it and put up with it, and finally, boom, I'm done, That's it. I'm out of here, Ain't doing that no more. And even though I hate to admit it, I acted that way with my kids too sometimes when they were younger. Put up with things and then finally just fly off the handles. And I've had enough. So how many times I've told you not to do that? I told you over and over again, don't do that. Go out in the driveway. I'll be out there in a minute to run you over. No, it wasn't that bad, but. But I mean, isn't the anger/punishment thing a rather human characteristic? Isn't that something that we as humans do rather than what God should be doing or does, right? I mean, we want to project our ideas and our feelings and the way we do things. We want to project that on God and say that's how God must be, only He's just he's a slower burn than I am, right? He's just better at it than I am. He takes longer before he's finally had enough, you know. But isn't that how we often see God? Is especially the God of the Old Testament, that's what he did, was just kind of a slow burn until finally he's had enough, and that's it. On the other hand, we also know that as far as we're talking about the salvation of those who lived in the Old Testament, that the possibility that they had to live by the Ten Commandments, all those kind of things. On the other hand, since Jesus hadn't even been born yet, much less died and rose again, then how could the people of the Old Testament possibly be saved by the death of someone who hadn't even been born yet, right? So we kind of discount that from the outset. I'll speak for myself. I've often kind of, in my lifetime, discounted that, not even thought about that from the outset, saying, well, Jesus hadn't happened yet, so they had to have something different there. There had to be another way that they did that they got into heaven, that they got on God's good side, and all those different kind of things. So how could they possibly do that? Well, so the most common assumption about how people in the Old Testament got into heaven is that they live by the Ten Commandments, and that's sometimes what people today think as well. Would you say that's a fairly accurate assumption with many of you? Yeah, that's how they did things back then. As a matter of fact, a very large segment of our world today, probably the vast majority of our world today, believes the same principle applies to our day and time, even especially and especially as believers in Jesus Christ. That now that you're a believer, now you know better, now live by the rules. Be obedient. Do what God says. Everything will be cool in your life. Don't do what God says. Hey, you know what? He's a slow burn, but you don't want to push it. And so depending on the severity of your sin, God may even decide at some point in time, to just take you out. I mean, and we look back at the Old Testament and say, well, didn't God prove it? He finally had enough with those few thousand people and opened up the earth and swallowed them. And didn't he have enough way back in the beginning when they lived like hell, and finally they got down to, the flood, and God said, that's it, I've had it. Noah and his wife and 3 sons and their wives, that's all he saved out of that bunch. Wipe them out. I've had enough. Ain't doing this no more, kind of thing. So we want to kind of project that in our lives today as believers and say, now that you're a believer especially, this applies to you because you know better now. And now you shouldn't be doing that no more. However, there are several problems with that particular kind of idea or theology or whatever you want to call that. So first of all, the first problem that I see here, and there are many, and we're only going to talk about 1 or 2 major ones here, but first of all, Paul tells us about the time between Adam and Moses when there was no law. Obviously, before Moses arrived on the scene and got the 10 Commandments on the mountain, there was no law. There wasn't a law that you could break. Okay? And he says here, for until the law, that means before the law was given to Moses, which means between Adam and Eve and Moses, which a whole bunch of time there, we'll cover that in a minute, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed or counted against you. That's what that big fancy word imputed means, is not counted against you when there is no law. There was sin, but there was no law, so you go, wait a minute, how can it be sin if there was no law to say it was sin? Well, we still know what moral law is and all those kind of things, but God had never said don't do this or don't do that, so he couldn't condemn them for doing something that they there wasn't any law that said this is wrong. Make sense? I know it's weird, but it's there. That's what it says. So whatever time there was that elapsed between the time of Adam and Eve and had committed the very first sin and the time when God actually gave the 10 Commandments, God did not hold their sins against them. He did not hold their sins against them. Okay, So here's a multiple answer test for you. Check this out. How many years elapsed between Adam and Moses? How many you think? How many of you say A? How many say B? How many of you say C? Okay. How many say D? 25. Okay, your D is correct. It was over 2,500 years that there was no law. Sin was still there, but there was no law, so God did not hold their sins against them during that time. Is that weird? Does it kind of change your thinking about Old Testament a little bit? That's weird. I mean, wow, 2,500 years. Good night. So, meaning that, there's no way that God, He didn't. He couldn't hold them accountable for their sin because there was no law that said there was sin. Yes, they still sinned, didn't they? Absolutely. Paul said so. They still sinned. Absolutely they did. So, then how did they get into heaven? You see the point? If there's 2,500 years there when, there was sin, but God didn't hold their sins against them, then how did they get into heaven? Wow, kind of weird, huh? Okay, so on the other hand, let's say that you are actually able, let's say that you today, or they back then, were actually able to keep the 10 Commandments. Like Jesus, like we know that Jesus did. He never sinned, never did anything wrong, never broke a single commandment, not in word, not in deed, not even in thought. One evil thought ever, even for a split, a fleeting moment. Let's say that you were able to do that. Would you then be allowed to get into heaven? Remember, we're talking about today, but we're also looking back at the Old Testament because the idea is that they lived by the 10 Commandments, therefore they got into heaven. So if they did it right, they got to heaven. If they did it wrong, they didn't. So if you were today, were able to live by the 10 Commandments like Jesus did, without any faults, without ever sinning, even in the slightest bit, not even in your thought life ever, would you get into heaven on that basis? Well, the Bible says no. The Bible says no. As a matter of fact, Paul says directly in Romans chapter 3 and verse 20, he said, by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. In other words, what he's saying there is that by keeping the law, even if you could keep it perfectly and never sin in thought or deed, you still can't be justified in God's sight. What's the word justified mean? Yes, thank you. Just as if I'd never sinned. Just as if I'd never sinned. That's what the word justified means. You can never be that way in God's sight. Even if you were able to keep the law perfectly, you still would not be justified in God's sight on that basis. So if the people in the Old Testament didn't get into heaven by the 10 Commandments, then all those different kind of things, how did they get? How did things go? Well, if that's the case, we looked at those two things, then the fact is salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ is and still is the way of salvation. Okay, let me say it this way. If the people in the Old Testament didn't get into heaven by keeping 10 Commandments, then how did they? Well, the quickest and most direct answer, and I'm going to give you that answer up front first, and then we'll kind of take a little closer look at it. Let me give you that answer up front. They got into heaven back then in exactly the same way as you and I do today. Do I need to say that again? They got into heaven back then, before Jesus ever died, was buried, and rose again. They got into heaven back then in the very exact same way that you and I get into heaven today. If you think about it, and I'm going to look at this from a little different direction to help you kind of grasp that thought for a second. If you think about it, it is just as legitimate for people to ask today how we can be saved by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that happened 2,000 years ago as it is for us to ask about how they could be saved by the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ that didn't happen yet. As a matter of fact, did you notice here that the timeline is close, but do you know there was actually more time in the Old Testament before Jesus died, buried, and rose again than there is now? We live closer to that time than what they did. But it's really close timeline. So is there a difference? No, there is no difference. We look back to an event that happened. They look ahead to an event that would happen. So they were saved by the same way that we are, is by believing in Jesus, the Messiah. They believed He would come, and He would pay for their sins, and He would die, and He would be buried, and He would rise again on the third day that they might have life in His name. We look back and say, that event happened, and I believe that that's who Jesus is, right? We call Him Jesus, they called Him the Messiah, because when Jesus came, He said, here's my name. We find His name all through the Old Testament too. So, we look back by faith. They looked ahead by faith. Only difference. The only difference. They looked ahead by faith into what would happen in the future. We look back by faith by what we know happened in the past. So the fact is, salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ is, and always will be the only way of salvation for all people of all ages in history, past, present, and future. That's awesome. Man, that's a lot better than thinking we have to keep 10 commandments or live by laws and all those different kind of things like we thought they did back then. And like a lot of believers think today, and a lot of religions teach today, that now that you're a believer, you got to live by the 10 commandments, or you're going to suffer God's judgment, all those different kind of things. Wow, if they were saved in the same way we are, that's awesome. Because the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, by grace through faith in Him, is the way of salvation then, now, and forever. Always has been, is, and always will be the way that we enter heaven. Okay, next question then. When does or did their salvation take effect? How many of you ever written a will? How many of you have written a will for your property? Okay. I started to do that one time. I started to fill out the papers. It's been a while back. And then I never did finish it. And I always think I really should finish that sometime. Yeah, I really should do that. And I say that a lot. Well, every time my thought crosses my mind, I really should finish that up. Really should get after that and do that, I've got some things written down already, but I just haven't ever really finished it, Well, the reason I asked that question about writing a will, and this series could be called The Will, is because the word testament for, like we understand Old Testament and New Testament, actually means will. It's a will, written out will. That means that the Old Testament is actually the old will that God had drawn up between, that particular period of time and for that particular period of time in history, and that in that old will, God had required them to follow all kinds of rules, regulations, and commandments and all that kind of stuff, all of which were designed to simply be a shadow or a representation of all the good things that were to come. That's what it was all about. Howard, just like the will that we might draw up for ourselves, for our property or whatever it might be concerning our earthly possessions, God had to die before that new will could take effect. How many of you ever seen that bumper sticker that says, "I'm spending my children's inheritance"? Yeah. Now's a good time to do that. You can't do it after you're dead, believe it or not. It's too late, A pastor friend of mine, and as a matter of fact, some of you probably know him, Pastor Ray. That's his first name. His last name is Ray. His first name is Eugene, but I always call him Pastor Ray, so don't get confused. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And he's a man I basically call my pastor. I I answered the call of God on my life to be a pastor under his ministry. He taught me, all the stuff I really needed to know, those kind of things. He's my mentor. He's like a dad, was like a dad to me. He's still alive. He's like 88, 90 years old. I don't know. And still just as sharp as he can be up, in his head. He told me and it's been many years ago now, he told me that he said he had drawn up his will, and that he left all of his stuff to all his things to a particular denomination, church denomination. And he said, the reason I've done that is because, especially as a pastor, you see a lot of this kind of stuff happening, is when they go to read the will, some of you may even experienced this, then the children get to fighting over whatever was in the will, right? Even though you wrote the will, then they got to fight over who gets this and who gets that and who gets something else. And he said, I do not want my children hating each other after I'm dead, so everything I own goes somewhere else. They make their own lives. I think it's not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. Because I've seen families just completely split apart, as probably some of you have, over possessions. When my dad died, which has been about 22 or 23 years ago, and he was living in Minnesota, he was a pastor, living in Minnesota at the time, and my brothers and sister called and said, hey, meet us up there, we're going to split up all the stuff and clean the house out and all that kind of stuff. I said, no, I'm not going. I'm just not going. I said, you know what, whatever Dad wanted me to have, he gave it to me before he died. And I'm not going to get involved in who gets this and who gets that and what's, whatever. You all just split it up any way you want to. I'm good with it. Not a problem. I'm okay with it. And one of the possessions I have is a great big pocket watch that my dad gave me. And actually he gave it to me on the day that I was ordained as a pastor. Not that that really means anything in my opinion, but that was that day. And he gave that big pocket watch. And he told me the history behind it and those kind of things. And it means a lot to me. And it means more to me than all that other stuff. None of that other stuff means anything. Because Dad gave it to me specifically. He knew I liked it. I always seen it on his desk when I was a kid. It doesn't run. I just loved it. Big old pocket watch with one of them quarter-inch thick glasses on the front. You have to unscrew the back to change it. I guess it's a railroad watch. And it is my favorite possession. Because it was from my dad. Right? Well, God is the same way. God has drawn up this will, and it is awesome. He has given us, you know what He's given us? Everything. Everything. God leaves us everything. The inheritance that God leaves us is not just to us who lived during the New Testament times either, It's also for the people of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, as well as those who come in the future. So take a look at what Paul says in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 15 about the reason that Jesus died on the cross. And he says, for this reason. Now we're going to stop right there for a second. For this reason. For what reason? Well, the fact is, it's for the reason that Jesus died on the cross and was buried and rose again. He said that's the reason. He said, and so I'm fixing to give you the answer to that question. For this reason, He is the mediator of a new covenant. Why? Well, let's go on. So that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. So he's talking about this eternal inheritance that we receive at the death of Jesus Christ. The only difference being that under the old covenant or the old will, people had to look forward by faith to receive that, whereas we look back by faith to receive that inheritance. And that's the only real difference. I said that a moment ago, and this is the same thing. So how can you collect on God's will and testament? How do you collect on that? How does a person collect on that? Because the death has already taken place. The will has been read. How do you collect on that? How can you become an heir to all that God has for us and for those who are His? Well, it's very simple. It's simply by believing in Him. That's it. That's it. You don't have to go to church. You don't have to walk an aisle. You don't have to say certain magic words. I was taught that. You have to say certain words, and the preacher would say these words. He'd say them, and then you'd say them, and he'd say some more, and you'd say some more. You don't have to do that. As a matter of fact, it needs to come from your heart, and whatever those words might be, it's cool. I don't care what it is. Even if there isn't any spoken words, the words that need to come from there, the thought that needs to come from there is this: Jesus is who he says he is. I believe that Jesus is who he says he is. Okay, Paul says that directly in Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. We looked here many times. We're going to look at it again, just real quick. It said, if you'll confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, that means I'm saying from the deepest part of my being that Jesus is who he says he is, you'll be saved. Does it say, is there any sin there? Does he say confess your sins? Does he say walk the aisle? Does he say certain words? No, he didn't say confess your sin. No, he said confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. And what happens? Boom, you're saved. Because it's with the heart a person believes, resulting in righteousness, being right with God. And with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. That's how you receive this awesome inheritance. And it doesn't stop there, because it is absolute total freedom when you believe in Jesus Christ. It's not a keeping of more rules and regulations like we're so often taught, like they did in the Old Testament. Now that you're a believer, you got to do this and do that. No, the will's been read, and the will says you get everything. It was for freedom that Christ has set you free, so that you could simply be free. Not free to work for him, not free to do more for him, but just simply free to do what God has called you to do, and to be who God has called you to be. So God's promise was that one day in the Old Testament, he said, one day I'll come and I'll die. And that it's going to take effect, And they look forward to that day. We look back to that day. People of all ages in history, past, present, and future. And once that happens, once we receive him, once we receive his life within us, once we believe that he is who he says he is, the inheritance is ours. Not just an eternity in heaven, not just after you die, but right now. The freedom, the awesomeness begins today. Not sometime in the future. God is awesome. He has given us everything. The Lord is a warrior who died in your place and in my place, so that we might be truly free. The Lord is his name. Lord bless you all. Amen. Give God a hand.